Chanukah, Purim, and Assimilation. This is the time of year where we run into a lot of difficult family issues if you're Jewish and part of your family is not Jewish. That can be if you've converted, if somebody else is converted, if your kids or grandkids are in interfaith marriages or interfaith households. There are all sorts of situations where you might be Jewish, but your entire family is not necessarily all Jewish. And this is a time of a lot of strain on those relationships just because it's that special season of the year. As indicated by this image to the left, we've got these competing holidays that happen this time of year, and it just so happens that the message of Chanukah is perfect for understanding some of the basis of how to approach and think about these issues. So first of all, this is not just a class about that. This is adult education. You're learning the real stuff, the nuts and bolts of Judaism. And let's begin with just defining a basic concept here of rabbinic holidays. What is a rabbinic holiday? It's a holiday created by the rabbis. It's a holiday that does not show up in the Torah, but arose at some later point. So you already know the holidays that show up in the Torah. You've got Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. You've got Sukkot and Shavuot and Pesach, but not in that order. You've got a couple of others that are specifically mentioned. You've got Rosh Chodesh, the head of each new month. If you follow me or Temple Emmanuel, or both preferably on Facebook, each month you get a new little snippet of information about what's the spiritual nature of each given month that we're entering. And in fact, we're about to enter a brand new month because Hanukkah always takes place over the course of Rosh Chodesh, of a new month, because it starts on the 25th of Kislev, and there are only 29 or 30 days in Kislev, depending on the year. So the end of Hanukkah is actually in a brand new month, which means Rosh Chodesh happens during Hanukkah every single year. But Hanukkah is never mentioned in the Torah. Why? Because it happened centuries after, almost 1,000 years after the lifetime of Moses, after the time of the Torah holidays. So we've got other rabbinic holidays as well. They were instituted not by Moses, not by the Torah, but by the rabbis later on. Let's take a look at Purim. Purim is actually a hybrid. It's part rabbinic and part biblical, because Purim actually does show up in the Bible in a biblical period. It's the book of Esther. You've all heard of the book of Esther, I hope. You read about it in your readings. The book of Esther tells the story of the holiday that we now celebrate as Purim, and it describes the holiday of Purim, and it is a book of the Bible. It is not one of the prophets, and it's not part of the Torah, but it is still part of the Bible, so part of the holiday comes from the Bible because it comes from the book of Esther, but much of the holiday, including the fast of Esther and other things related to the holiday, really are rabbinic in origin. So Purim straddles that line. What is the story of Purim, and how does it relate to the story of Hanukkah? Why are we talking about it today? That's coming up. Of course, we've got Hanukkah. We're in the middle of Happy Hanukkah, everyone. Chag Urim Sameach. That's the fancy way to say Happy Hanukkah. I'll teach you later. Just give me a call. And it's not an important one. 90% of the Jews out there who have been Jewish their whole life, if I say Chag Urim Sameach, They say, yes, you too. That's fine. That's fine. You're not missing out. Um, it's a lovely phrase. You should learn it, but not right now. Chanukah, of course, the story of Chanukah, the Maccabees, happened way after the period of the Bible was closed. There were no new biblical books. There were no new biblical writings. The Bible was closed. It was done. It was finished. And so it was the rabbis who instituted the holiday of Hanukkah. We also have other, I would argue, more minor holidays like Tisha B'Av or Tu B'Shvat, which is the 9th of Av, the 15th of Shvat. We'll talk about those in another class. These are other examples of rabbinic holidays. So let's talk about Purim. What is Purim all about? It all takes place in the book of Esther. What happens in the book of Esther? The basic storyline of the book, so to speak, is it starts off with this king Ahasuerus, who rules over the land of Persia, which is the largest kingdom that existed at the time. He's been identified, if it is indeed a historical story, and going way, way back to some of the early rabbinic commentators, there's discussion of whether or not Purim is a historical story or whether it's an allegory. This is not a modern conversation. It happens with the book of Esther, and it happens with the book of Job, that rabbis, even going back 1,000 years, debate whether or not these are historical events being reported or if they are allegorical stories that are meant to teach us an important lesson. So the story of Esther, Ahasuerus, you've got this king. He's been identified. If it's a historical account, that's probably Xerxes. If you ever watched, what was that movie about the Spartans? 300. Very graphic, violent film. I can't recommend it. I happen to enjoy it, but I cannot, as a rabbi, I can't recommend it to you. Also terrible history. Don't watch it for a historical perspective. But that's Xerxes, and the guy with all the piercings on the big tall. I see a couple of heads nodding there. Yeah, that's Xerxes. That's Ahasuerus. Very different depiction from what we get in the book of Esther. Ahasuerus he loves to party. He's not very responsible. He doesn't really know what's going on in his kingdom. He's kind of a buffoon, you might say. Is that a fair assessment, Sarah? What do you think? Would you say he's a bit of a buffoon? That's fair? Okay. Ahasuerus, not necessarily an evil character. Certainly not good. He's
maybe a teenager mindset.
Something like that. Arrested Development, right? So he ends up at the very beginning of the story divorcing his wife. I'm really flattening the story out in a lot of different ways. And gets rid of his wife and says, we're going to have a contest to find a new wife, and it's going to be a beauty pageant. It's going to be a beauty contest. We're going to bring in all the most beautiful women in the land, and we're going to see who's going to be my new queen. And among those women was Esther. Where does the name Book of Esther come from? It comes from the lady, from Esther, who was this beautiful Jewish woman who had both a Jewish name and a Hebrew name and a secular name, meaning, just making sure we're still recording, meaning that she actually has a Hebrew name. Did you know that? Her Hebrew name is probably a name that you already know, but you might not know what it is. Does anybody know Esther's Hebrew name? Nobody? Esther's Hebrew name is Hadassah. We just had a big service with the organization named after Hadassah. That's Esther, named after the Adas plant, which has a lovely aroma. And there's even a rabbinic teaching. This is not found in the book of Esther. This is a later commentary, a later midrash about the book of Esther, that says the reason that she was so appealing above and beyond all of the other women is because she has a pleasing aroma. You can imagine, a couple thousand years ago, people were not taking daily showers. There was no hot water. Myrtle would be the. We also use that in the one of the four species is Hadassah or Hadass. So one of the commentaries is that she was pleasant smelling, and all of the other women were not so pleasant smelling because a couple thousand years ago they didn't have good hygiene. It's an interesting perspective, and most importantly, it makes it memorable. You're not going to forget that story, are you? Esther, she was beautiful and she smelled good. That's according to the Midrash. So Esther becomes the queen. She's selected by Achashverosh. At the same time, there is this wicked Haman, and everybody says, boo, boo, Haman, make a lot of noise, drown out the name of Haman, who gets angry at the leader of the Jewish community, whose name is Mordecai, who happens to be Esther's uncle. Uncle or cousin. It's different in different verses, and there's more midrash about that. They were not from Alabama. I shouldn't say that. Bad rabbi. Shame on you. That's not nice to make fun of a state. He was her uncle, and he happens to be the leader of the Jewish community. And he gets in this beef with Haman, and Haman, who is the advisor to the king, who, because the king is such a buffoon, really Haman is the one making the decisions and running things. He says to the king, I think we should get rid of these Jews. They won't bow down, because as Jews, we don't bow down to any other gods other than God. We don't worship human beings. This is one thing, again, from the movie 300. Xerxes shows up and says, I am a living God, bow down to me. You see that in the movie. That's also kind of in the story of Esther, where Haman wants people to bow down to him as their God. It doesn't mean you can't literally bow down. If you go to visit Japan as a Jew, you're allowed to bow. That's considered good manners. You're not worshiping somebody. You're just expressing good manners, which is permitted. In fact, it's even required. It falls under Dina de Malchuta Dina, which literally is the law of the land is the law, but it also applies to not just legal things, meaning you have to in order to follow the laws of Judaism, you also have to follow secular laws of the land you're living in, but it also applies to local customs and courtesies. And if you're in a place where it's customary to bow as a greeting, you're allowed to do that. But you're not allowed to bow down to an inanimate object or bow down in worship, which is what Haman was demanding. So Mordecai said, I'm not gonna bow down to you. Jews don't bow down to anyone but God. And Haman said, we got to wipe out these Jews. Esther used her position as queen, her position of authority. The king did not know that she was Jewish. She was totally assimilated. She not only has, where does this name Esther come from? Hadassah, that's a nice Hebrew sounding name, right? We know it's a plant. It grows in Israel. It's so Jewish. It's even, we use it in the lulav. That's like the most Jewish plant you could think of. Hadassah, it's a great Jewish name. When you're thinking about Hebrew names, that's something you might ruminate over if you're in the position of choosing a Hebrew name in the near future. What about Esther? Where does this name come from? Esther, it sounds like Easter, which happens around the same time as Purim. It's mostly a coincidence, but not entirely, because Esther also probably comes from Ishtar, which was a goddess of Persia. So here you've got this Jewish girl who's so assimilated, her own husband doesn't know she's Jewish. Her name is actually she's got a Hebrew name that she doesn't use. Does this sound like anybody you know? Probably a lot of people. And her secular name, so to speak, is actually named after a foreign god, foreign goddess. That's pretty assimilated. Nevertheless, she used her position of power with the king to persuade him, instead of killing the Jews, to kill Haman instead. And that's how we end up with Purim, which literally means lots, as in drawing lots, like a lottery, because that's how the date was chosen, the 13th of Adar, which became the festival of Purim. That was the day that all of the Jews were supposed to be executed in Persia, which again was the largest kingdom in the world at that time. That covered most of India all the way through Turkey and the land of Israel as well. A huge, huge empire at that time, largest empire in the world. And instead of the Jews all being wiped out, Haman was killed and his followers as well. And so we celebrate not the death of our enemies, but the survival of our people. If the Jews had been wiped out, then at that period of time, there would basically be no more Jews left. There might have been some Jews living in like Egypt at that time. There may have been a few Jews outside of the reach of Persia. There certainly would have been some who escaped, but basically that's most of the Jews in the world were within the kingdom of Persia at that time. It's customary during Purim, because it's this great big celebration, we get a little bit silly. We like to put on a Purim play, which is a reenactment, often very silly. If somebody sends me a reminder, and if I can find it, I'll send you. Actually, you can probably Google it even faster. There's a great, Dr. Seuss Purim play, which is the entire story of Purim in Dr. Seuss style. I used to teach a version of this class where each session was 2 hours, and we would go through the whole thing. Actually, let me, if I can find it quickly, I'll give you a little bit of an excerpt in a moment. We read through the entire play. It's allowed to be silly. Sometimes it's themed after a musical or themed after, a pop culture phenomenon. You might have a Star Wars theme Purim play. Or, I don't know, what's big in pop culture right now? Avengers themed Purim play. What do the kids like? Frozen. Frozen is even better. It's very popular to have a musical Purim play where you do parody songs, and it's supposed to be silly, it's supposed to be fun, because it is such a joyous celebration that, like many Jewish holidays, the story is they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. You never heard that before? Oh, it's a classic. I wish I came up with it. It's a classic. During this process, we put on costumes. This is where Purim gets the reputation, by the way, as the Jewish Halloween, which could not be more wrong. The only parallel is that there are costumes and there's festivity. Otherwise, they could not be more different. But people do dress up in costumes. This is the only, because everything is so upside down. Everything got flipped upside down on this 13th of Adar, where the good triumphed over evil, the oppressor became the oppressed, where thank goodness everything was backwards. And so we do a lot of things backwards. Even prayers, you have things that you do only on Purim. You have, in Orthodox communities, cross-dressing is really popular on Purim, where you'll see these, very frum, black hat rabbis wearing their wives' dresses, which normally would be something unthinkable in a frum community, and yet For Purim, it's acceptable because everything is backwards. So you can never point to Purim as an example of ritual law, because Purim is davka, the opposite of what it should be. Of course, this is all a big part of the celebration. There's drinking. The common phrase is you're supposed to drink until you can't tell the difference between Haman, the villain of the story, and Mordecai, the hero of the story. Although there are a lot of interesting things about that, you actually do not have to drink yourself into a stupor. That's actually a bit of a myth. It's a very common myth about Purim. There's a grain of truth to it, like a lot of myths. You are supposed to be joyous, and you are supposed to drink if you're able to do so healthfully. If it's unhealthy for you to drink, then you're forbidden to do so. But you are allowed to have one sip of or rather, you're required to have at least one sip of wine or juice on Purim and fall asleep happy. Because if you're asleep, then you don't know the difference. You don't have to drink until you pass out. You just have to drink something nice and then fall asleep. Although there are many, many Jewish communities in the world that, for better or for worse, on Purim, people do drink themselves into a stupor until they really can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman. Partying goes without say. It's also a great holiday for kids. You've already got the costumes in there. You've got the silly play and the stories, and you have many congregations all around the world will have carnivals or games or things like that. It's not just a celebration. It's not just a big party. There is some spiritual meaning to the holiday as well. We show this by giving out mishloach manot or shaloch manos, depending on what kind of community you're in. That's the Hebrew and the Yiddish. And if you're in a community where Yiddish culture is very popular, you usually hear shaloch manos. Sarah, is that something you've heard before? How do you know it as? Shaloch manos or mishloach manot?
I know it with both names.
Either or. So you've got mishloach manot, you've got shaloch manos. It's the same thing, which are gifts that you give, usually gifts of food, usually at least 3 different types of food. That can include wine, that can include challah, that can include candy, that can include all sorts of different things. Could be an entire meal. And you give these gifts out, and it can include other, little trinkets and things in the gifts as well. And you give these out to everyone you know. What a great way to do charity, because this is a way to feed people who might be down on their luck, but there's no embarrassment. You're not giving food to somebody who's poor just because they're poor, because you're giving food to everybody. You're giving food to your friends, to your family, your parents, your kids, whoever. And it's a great tradition. I don't know what the custom is here in the Valley. There have been some places where I've lived where I wish there was a much stronger tradition of mishloach manot, because I think it's one of the most overlooked traditions of Purim if you travel around the world. I don't know what it's like in the Valley, but we'll find out when we get closer to Purim. Someone will let me know. And we'll have a lovely mishloach manot exchange that we'll do for Purim. So let's compare that with Hanukkah. Hanukkah comes not from a biblical book, at least not in our Bible, but it is recorded in a book, which is the Book of Maccabees. The Book of Maccabees describes it's actually 2 books, Maccabees 1 and 2. It's preserved in the Christian Bible, although it was certainly familiar to the rabbis, and as an extra biblical text. That means doesn't mean that it's more biblical than anything else. It means it's outside the Bible as an extra biblical text, at least outside our Bible. It's a great example of a text that has been preserved in the Jewish tradition and in the Christian tradition as well. Ironically, given the content of the book of Maccabees. So, the book of Maccabees itself tells the story of the wars of the Maccabees when King Antiochus IV, who was the ruler of the Syrian Greek Empire, the Seleucids. You'll have to come to my class tomorrow to find out more detail about that. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty. Outlawed the practice of Judaism in the land of Israel in favor of Greek practices. Converted the temple in Jerusalem into a Greek temple to the god Zeus. Created a it was used for Greek offerings, which included, it was used to store livestock and pigs, and just completely desecrated this place that was holy for Jews. The Maccabees led an uprising against Greece to reinstate Jewish practice, to reinstate studying Torah, to reinstate the temple sacrifices, and most famously began with reinstating the temple lights, the Ner Tamid, the eternal lamp. If you go into the synagogue, if you go to any synagogue and you look up right above the ark, you'll see a light that's never goes out. It's always on. That's the eternal light. It's in most synagogues it's electric. In ancient times it was a burning lamp, and that lamp was fed constantly so that the light never went out. In the temple, this was a menorah that had 7 branches for the 7 days of the week, as opposed to the Hanukkah menorah, also called a Chanukiah. Some people will say it's not a menorah, it's a Chanukiah. Let me give a quick grammar lesson, or a quick, it's not grammar, etymology. A menorah comes from the word ner, which means light. So any candelabra, anything that holds multiple lights, any lamp is a menorah. Chanukiah is a Hanukkah menorah, a menorah for celebrating Hanukkah. So some people will say, don't call it a menorah, it's a Chanukiah. Actually, Chanukiah as a word is only about 200 years old. It was one of, as the modern Hebrew language was being revived, it was one of the words that was created to describe the Hanukkah menorah. Because they said, we need a different word for this. We need something, it's a Chanukiah. So you can call it a Chanukiah, you can call it a menorah, and menorah is also correct. Well, the Maccabees went through and they found just a little bit of oil. What was so special about this oil? Because the oil that's used in the lamp has to be a particular grade of oil. It has to be, not just extra virgin olive oil, but like extra virgin olive oil, right? It has to be from the very first drops of oil that come from the grapes, not grapes, from the olives. I guess you can get oil from grapes, but this is olive oil we're talking about. If you go to Israel right now, probably they will make you quarantine for 2 weeks because there's a pandemic. But if you were in Israel already right now, you personally could go, and there are a lot of there are charities and there are tourist experiences where you can go and take part in the olive harvest. And basically you take a big stick and you hit the branches so that the olives fall down out of the tree. You've got like a blanket or a sheet or a net underneath the tree. You gather up the olives. You put them in a big like barrel type thing with a screw on the top, and it squeezes it down. That's an olive press. And then out of the bottom the juices come, and then that separates into the water and the oil. And then that first bit of oil that's the most pure, and this whole process has to be overseen by the priests in ancient Israel, today by rabbis if you're talking about kosher olive oil, which is sort of a complicated, that's another discussion for another time. And it takes some time. It takes about a week to do this whole process and to get enough oil to burn the lamp and to, sort of reinstate the supply lines, right? We've seen what's happened to supply lines with just a little disruption. This is following a civil war in the land of Israel, following the Maccabees uprising. They knew it would take a week. But nevertheless, they had just this one small cruse of oil that they knew was enough to burn for one night. They put it in the lamp anyway, in the menorah, and a miracle happened on the second night. It was still burning. Another miracle happened on the third night. It was still burning. And for 8 days, it continued to burn. That's the miracle of the lights that we celebrate on Hanukkah today. It's also why we eat greasy foods. I'll get to that in a second. So here's the big question. Living as Jews, we are not living in the land of Israel. We are not living in the times of the Maccabees. We are living in a city which is known as the South Pole of Texas. And we have a huge Christmas parade every year. And we have tourists that come in just to see the Christmas parade. How do we deal with Hanukkah and Christmas at the same time? This is the ultimate anti-assimilation holiday, right? The Maccabees were fighting against assimilation. In fact, there were a lot of Jews living in the land of Israel at the time who were fine with the Greeks. They said, let's get rid of these old-fashioned Jewish customs. We don't need those things anymore. Let's take the Greeks. They've got architecture. They got philosophy. They've got running water. Maybe these Greeks aren't so bad. Maybe we should be a little more Greek. And there were people in the land of Israel. We know this from the book of Maccabees. There were some who were fine with assimilating into Greek culture, Hellenistic culture. And the Maccabees were fighting against that idea, saying, no, we're Jewish and we're going to stay Jewish. So this difficulty that we face today is not a new thing. In fact, that's what Hanukkah is all about. We're going to get a little bit more into that in just a moment. What are the Hanukkah traditions? We talked about lighting the menorah. Here's a quick, if you're taking notes, this is a good spot to take a couple notes. You can write it down very quickly. Here's the practical how-to of lighting menorah. I do have my menorah here. As you've got your menorah, you're going to start. I'm looking at it backwards though. So here's my shamash, and you're going to start. The first day you would put a candle here, all the way on the far right, because Hebrew is read from right to left. So you're filling up the menorah from right to left. So you start with the first candle on the far right. On the second night, you would put 2 candles in the 2 rightmost spots. And the third day, 3 candles, 4 candles, 5 candles, all the way until you've got the entire thing filled up with candles on the 8th night. Each day, when you light the candles, you fill in the candles from right to left, but you light them from left to right. Why? Because you always start with today's candle first. Today is the most important day. Period. That's the whole, there's no comma in that sentence. That's the whole thing. Today is the most important day. If you follow me on Facebook or you follow the temple, I hope you're doing both. You'll see a teaching every single day relating to the candles or Hanukkah or other little snippets of ideas. That's one of them that you'll see coming up today or tomorrow, I think. I don't remember what order I put them in. Or maybe you already saw it. Was that already on there? Anybody following those? You should be. They're good. All right. If I do say so myself. So you light the menorah. That's how you light the menorah. We also have dreidel. As the story goes, the rabbis, because studying Torah was forbidden, it was one of the things that was outlawed, they had to study in secret. And so they would have the Torah scroll out, and they'd be studying Torah and maybe studying other texts, we don't know. And then when the Greek soldiers would be coming to inspect, they would quickly cover up the Torah, take out a dreidel because it's very portable, right? That doesn't take a lot of setup to play dreidel, and start spinning, and the Greeks would come and say, oh, those Jews are gambling again. Gambling is totally permitted in Judaism, by the way. Uh, I don't know why gambling gets such a bad rap in other religions, but gambling, again, just like all things in healthy moderation, if it's unhealthy for you to gamble, don't do it. If it's unhealthy for you to drink alcohol, don't do it. But there's nothing, theologically wrong with gambling in Judaism. I don't know where that idea comes from. I don't know. Why should there be something wrong with it? I don't know. One of you will have to explain that to me if you know. So they would come and they say, oh, those Jews, they're just gambling, they're playing with the dreidel, and they would keep going. And so that's how the study of Torah was kept alive during this period when it was forbidden. We've got foods cooked in oil. The high schoolers, earlier today, I was just with the high schoolers. We did a demonstration of how to cook latkes, and I got to eat some of the latkes at the end, and it was fantastic. Of course, we had to do it over Zoom like this, but we sent out, Claudia Silberman, who's teaching the high schoolers with me, sent out packages to all of the high schoolers with potatoes and onion and egg and all of the ingredients that they needed to make latkes, and it was a lot of fun. They made them at home. We made them, here, and then we got to eat the latkes at the end. What are latkes cooked in? Oil. What are sufganiyot? That's a kind of Israeli donut. What are donuts cooked in? Oil. What did we have if you were there last night at our incredible, really wonderful Hanukkah celebration? We had latkes cooked in oil. We had sufganiyot. Okay, they weren't sufganiyot, but we did have Shipley's donuts, and they're cooked in oil, and they were delicious. I always drive by Shipley's, and there's any time, day or night, that I drive by, there's a line going around where people are picking up their Shipley's donuts, and I always thought that place must be really good because it's always busy. And now I know. Unfortunately for me, and unfortunately for my belt, now I know they really are that good. So we enjoy these kinds of fried foods, and there are other Jews living in other parts of the world that have different traditions of different kinds of fried foods. Like I said, sufganiyot are Israeli, latkes are Ashkenazi. There are different Sephardic and Mizrahi traditions about different fried foods. Fried in oil to remind us of the celebration of the miracle of the oil. So we've got the Maccabees on the one hand, the ultimate anti-assimilation hero, led by Mattathias. He was the father of Judah Maccabee and Simon, all of the Maccabees. And on the other hand, we've got Esther, who is like the ultimate assimilated protagonist. Esther was totally assimilated. She didn't know very much about her own Judaism. There's even a position where her uncle, Mordecai, who's the leader of the Jewish people, is fasting, and she comes out of the palace and says, "Uncle, why are you fasting? Eat something." She didn't understand what he was doing or why he was doing it. She was totally disconnected during that time from her Jewish culture. But she still was Jewish. She still felt Jewish. There's a lot of great midrash exaggerating the Jewishness of Esther living in that period. There's midrash about how she managed to keep kosher even though she was living in a totally unkosher palace with the king, without the king finding out. I mean, there's no limit to great stories about Esther. She's one of these, great. She's like the original Disney princess. This is one princess your kids are allowed to dress up as, because she really is an incredible hero. But she's not famous in the story for her knowledge. She's not famous for her zeal for Judaism. She's not famous for her tremendous wisdom. She's famous for her beauty and for her courage. Those are the two things that Esther is most known for because, by the way, as this totally assimilated Jewish figure, it's also pretty clear from the story that if she had said nothing to the king, if she hadn't gotten involved, her life most likely would have been spared. The king didn't know she was Jewish. Haman didn't know she was Jewish. And she probably could have passed as a non-Jew and lived out the rest of her days while the Jewish people were killed. And in fact, she had to risk her own life. She had to take an action that specifically put her life in danger by revealing that she was Jewish and by making a request of the king, because there was no fixed way to make a request of the king, and if he didn't accept your request, basically you were killed. That was the way that it worked. That's a pretty big gambit. The answer is yes or you're dead. It's not just yes or no. That's pretty intense. So we talked about Esther's name. We talked about her culture, her appearance, her disconnection from her community. She's not the only example of an important biblical figure who was assimilated. Right now we're reading in the Torah the story of Joseph, who went down to Egypt, who married an Egyptian woman, who named his children Egyptian names, who in fact was so Egyptian that when his brothers meet him years later, some 20 years later after they sell him into slavery down into Egypt, his brothers see him in person and they don't recognize him. They just say, look at that Egyptian over there. That's what the Torah actually says. Okay, it's a paraphrase. But they call him an Egyptian because when they look, he looks totally Egyptian. They don't even recognize him. Not only do they not recognize him as their brother, they don't even recognize him as a Jew. He appears totally Egyptian to them. And he ends up being one of the most important figures in Jewish history. Were it not for Joseph and for his success in Egyptian society, there would be no Jewish people. We would have all died in the famine 3,000 years ago. Moses, who came, 400 something years later after Joseph, was also an assimilated figure. Moses, it's been suggested that even his name, Moshe, has an Egyptian origin. That's a little bit controversial. It could be Hebrew, it could be Egyptian. It's not clear, the origin of the name Moshe. But we do know that he gave his children, he also married a daughter of a priest, of another religion, a Midianite priest. Joseph married the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Moses married the daughter of a Midianite priest. He gave his children Egyptian names. He was raised in an Egyptian household, totally disconnected from his community and his culture. And again, the entire survival of the Jewish people as we know it today is dependent on his actions and the privilege that he had, to use a modern word that probably would not have made much sense to Moses, but to use his position as an assimilated Jew to save the Jewish people. So there are examples throughout the Tanakh, throughout the Bible, of assimilated Jews who used that position of assimilation into the mainstream society of wherever they were living, whether it was Egypt or Persia or Midian, to actually benefit themselves and the Jewish people in tremendous ways. Mattathias and the Maccabees, on the other hand, were fundamentalists. They didn't want to tolerate any assimilation. They didn't want any Hellenizing of Judaism. They didn't want any compromise. Their perspective was when you start to compromise on one thing, you end up compromising on everything. Judaism is for Jews, and that's the end of the story. We can't adopt other practices. You know, why was the temple in Jerusalem turned into a temple for Zeus? Why Zeus in particular? Well, to the Greeks, Adonai looked a lot like Zeus. They said, "Oh, okay. What does your god do? Oh, it lives in the sky. Okay, sky god. We got one of those. Your god now is Zeus. Same thing. They're basically interchangeable. That's how the Greeks saw it. That's why the temple was specifically turned into a temple for Zeus, because to the Greeks, our god is, oh, your god's in this. What does your god do? Controls the weather. Okay. What is your god? Where does your god live? In the heavens. Okay, Zeus. Now he's Zeus. Well, the Maccabees said, our God is not Zeus. Our God is Adonai. Our God is Hashem. Our God is Yud He Vav He. And they could not be more different from Zeus. And any compromise that you make to incorporate Hellenistic culture, Hellenistic just is a fancy way of saying Greek, Hellenistic culture into Judaism is a corruption of Judaism. Were it not for the Maccabees and their, in a way, their fundamentalist beliefs, Judaism would also have been destroyed. That's not the only example in Jewish history. You've got the Maccabees who brought their form of violent extremism, one could argue, and saved Judaism. You've got the Zealots and the Sicarii who fought off the Romans and died at Masada. Do you guys know about Masada? In the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, and if you ever go on a trip to Israel, for sure you got to go to Masada. You went, oh, my mom was behind me a second ago. I'll introduce them in a second. You've got out in the desert, not too far from the Dead Sea, you've got this huge plateau. It's like straight up on the sides and flat on the top. A plateau. And a mesa, if you will. La Briut. You've got this, on this, I mean, this is a great place to build a fortress, and that's exactly what one of the Herodian kings did, hundreds of years before the incident that I'm talking about, because it's out in the middle of the desert. It's got these vertical walls, so it's basically an impregnable fortress. It's impossible to get in there unless you want to. Well, now there's a little Zeppelin, is that what it's called? A little cable car that runs up the side, so it's very easy to get into. But if you really want to do it right, you got to take the snake path, if you're healthy enough to do it, which is called that because it snakes back and forth about 100 times going up the side of Masada. So you got to take the snake path if you're really serious about it. And you get up there and it's totally flat. You can see everything around. It's the most defensible, like, physical fortress you could imagine. When the Jewish zealots in the 60s, I don't mean the 1960s, I mean just the plain 60s, 60 Common Era, were fighting against the Romans, who again were oppressing Jews in a different period of time. They were driven out of Jerusalem, driven up to Masada, and that's where they made their final stand. They fought off the Romans. The Romans couldn't get to them, and the tragic story of Masada is that they refused to surrender to the Romans, even after the Romans starved them out. They ran out of food. They ran out of water. There was a well, but apparently even the well was dry. They continued fighting. The Romans didn't know what to do because they couldn't get to them. So they forced Jewish slaves, knowing that the rebels against Rome would not kill their fellow Jews. They forced Jewish slaves to build a ramp up the side of Masada, which is still standing today. This ramp that goes all the way up the side of this mountain. A massive, massive structure. It must have taken months to build. But the Romans had nothing but time and resources. You think the Romans had slaves? The Romans had slaves. They forced these Jewish slaves to build this huge ramp, and then finally, when they reached the top, the Roman forces rushed in, and they found that all of the Jews who were defending Masada, refusing to surrender, rather than give themselves up as captives to the Romans, had taken their own lives. This is such a powerful story of Jewish solidarity that it's where new soldiers in the IDF, those who are assigned the task of protecting the modern state of Israel, are sworn in to this day at Masada. It is such a powerful symbol of Jewish solidarity and refusal to give in just because there is a bigger threat, just because there might be a broader culture, the refusal to give in and give up Judaism, to stand your ground. It might be extreme, and at times in Jewish history it has been violent, but Judaism would not be here today were it not for these figures. So here we have these two extremes: near total extremism, fundamentalism, and near total assimilation. And we have examples of both throughout our history where, were it not for both of these at different times in Jewish history, we would not be here today. Were it not for the assimilation of Esther, who, because of her assimilation, had an ear of the king. Were it not for the assimilation of Joseph and Moses, who, because of their assimilation, had a position of authority and power where they could help their own people. And at the same, we would not exist today. And were it not for the extremism of, or the fundamentalism, the I don't know, there's probably a better word to use, of the Maccabees, of the Zealots, you know, where the word zeal comes from today, was from this group known as the Zealots, who fought off the Romans, who refused to give up, who refused to give in to the Romans, who stood their ground to the very end at Masada. Were it not for these sort of two poles of Judaism, we would not be here today. This tension is not something new to Judaism. This is something that has been a part of Judaism for thousands of years, going back to the very beginnings of our Jewish story. This is when the time of year when we feel it the most. This tension between Hanukkah and Christmas. So let me talk about some practical discussions. I'm not going to give you any answers. I'll give you some. I'm not going to give you any definitive answers, but I'll give you some answers to think about as you're asking these questions in your own families. How to give presents. What if your Christian family wants to give you a Christmas present? Or your kids a Christmas present? Or do you say, sorry, no presents. No presents, kids. Or do you say, well, we can give them the presents, but they have to be for Hanukkah. Where do Hanukkah presents come from? It's not just from Christmas presents, although that's a big influence. We've got Christmas presents, all the Jewish kids feel left out, so let's give them, some presents. It also comes from the Hanukkah gelt, the coins which were traditionally given out to kids to give to their teachers as a donation, or given to kids so that they could buy something for themselves. Often there was a tradition going back, again, hundreds and hundreds of years. Give your kid 2 coins, one to give to their teacher and one to spend for themselves, and then they'll associate, the joy of giving with receiving a gift as well. Beautiful Hanukkah tradition. I think it's one that should make a comeback. I don't know about you. I think that's a great one. When I was growing up in an interfaith home, when I was growing up, my mother converted as when I was an adult. My sister and I were both grown adults. And when I was young, She was a practicing Catholic. When we got presents, we got Christmas presents from mom's parents, from our grandparents on mom's side, and we opened them on Christmas. When we got presidents, when we got presents from the other side from Dad's side of the family, we opened them on Hanukkah. And when we got presents from other people, my parents would decide, should we give it to them on Hanukkah or for Christmas? And in my family, that's through long discussions how my parents worked out the balance. They were sure to help us understand that we were Jewish, my sister and I, and Christmas was not our holiday, but it was still a holiday that was a part of our family. And it was a holiday that we could celebrate as a way of supporting Mom, while she celebrated Passover and Hanukkah and Shabbat and all of these holidays with us. Probably the best way to explain this to kids, why are there different holidays? You can say, listen, Christmas and Hanukkah are holidays that belong to different people. They're just like birthdays. I have a birthday and you have a birthday. They're not the same, but I can celebrate my birthday and get presents on my birthday, even though it's not your birthday. And you can celebrate with me, and you can enjoy birthday cake on my birthday, even though it's not your birthday. And when your birthday comes around, then I can celebrate with you too. That's probably the easiest way to describe why there are different holidays for different people. And kids understand that. Do we get a tree? This is one of those age-old dilemmas. Well, it depends on what the Christmas tree represents. There are plenty of Jewish families, especially in the middle of the 20th century. It was very popular to have a Hanukkah bush, which was a Christmas tree in a Jewish home, not because there was an interfaith home. It could be everybody in the home was Jewish, but it was viewed as a purely secular American tradition. It had no religious content, and so a lot of Jews would go out and get a tree, and we just called it a Hanukkah bush. That custom is not really practiced today any longer, at least nobody that I know. Nobody that I grew up with, nobody that I've known in the different places that I've lived has ever had a Hanukkah bush in that sense. A Jewish home where they put up a tree just as a purely secular cultural tradition. Kind of like we have Thanksgiving, we eat turkey. We have Halloween, which, if you trace it back, was a religious holiday at one point. It comes out of Catholicism and sort of has an interesting path by which it arrived. I think it's kind of rejected by most Christians now, but that's its origin. You can dress up. Most rabbis will tell you, not all, but most, I will. Many rabbis, let me say that. Many rabbis will tell you, yeah, you can dress up on Halloween and go trick-or-treating. It's a secular tradition. It has no religious significance. You could even make the argument when it comes to a Christmas tree that it's not even really a Christian tradition, because the origins of the Christmas tree are totally pagan. The Germanic peoples, before they converted to Christianity, had a winter festival where they would put lights on an evergreen tree to celebrate the winter solstice. And that's where the Christmas tree comes from. It's about the rebirth of the sun. The days get shorter and shorter and shorter. You have a big festival, and then the days start getting longer again. So you could say, well, it's not really even a Christian thing. So how could it be? If it's fine for the Christians, then it should be fine for Jews as well, because it's not religious. However, in our society, I think it's impossible to look at a Christmas tree and not think about Christmas. To look at a Christmas tree and not think about the Christianity and the context around it. As a symbol, I would argue that it is something that is distinctly Christian. Even if it is celebrated in a secular way, it's something that is a symbol of Christianity. So do you get a tree? When I was growing up, we always had a tree. My Jewish father, who's in the kitchen right now, would go out with, what did you use, Pop, an axe?
An axe.
Would go out with an axe and chop down the biggest, tallest Christmas tree he could find. And we would bring it into the home. One year it was so tall it didn't even fit in. We had these peaked ceilings, and the Christmas tree was so tall we had to cut off the top, and then we had like a little mini Christmas tree because it was so tall it wouldn't even fit. And that was something that we did as a family to support Mom. If you'd like, I think that my mom and dad would even be willing to answer a couple of questions in a few minutes if you're interested in hearing from them directly. But these are the stories of my childhood that I can share with you about how my family answered some of these questions. These are not right or wrong answers. These are not even recommendations. They're just examples of what worked in my family. How do you talk to your family about conversion? This is a really tough one. For those of you who are converting, it really depends on your family. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. When you're talking about converting to Judaism, there are some of you who may have family members who will never understand, regardless of how much time you give them, will never understand and appreciate your choice to be Jewish. In fact, many of you, even though you're called Jews by choice when you convert, for many of you, it really isn't a choice. It's what's in your spirit and in your soul to be Jewish, and it's not something that you can help. It's just a process of getting there that you're going through. These conversations can be difficult. I find a couple of things. Number one, there are some people who will never understand and appreciate and accept your Judaism. That's a reality. There are some relationships which will be damaged and may never heal through your conversion to Judaism. I've seen it happen, and it's tragic, but it's an unavoidable truth, and I'm not going to lie to you. That can happen. The best approach that I've found is to continue to be open to reconciliation in your life, and you can't control what somebody else believes. I've also known people who kept their conversion from certain members of their family, from their parents, for decades, who said, I can never tell my grandma that I'm converting to Judaism because that relationship is too important to me, and it's a part of me that I have to keep from her in order to save that relationship. And that's a tough decision, to keep a big part of yourself from somebody who you love. But for some people, that's the solution and the compromise that they've found in their families. On the second that's one category, that's the toughest situation. The next toughest situation is having a family member that completely rejects the idea, but may over time come around to it. And I see this happen. In fact, the biggest thing, many people who convert are converting as they're marrying into a Jewish family. I'm looking around. I don't know. I guess there are a couple in the group this year. Not as many as usual. But very often when somebody's converting in order to join a Jewish family by marriage, or I shouldn't say that's the purpose of their conversion, but that's how the conversion emerges. Very often what will happen is their Christian family, and I say Christian because that's usually where I've run into issues. Never had issues with Hindu families, although I've worked with people who converted from Hinduism to Judaism. I've never. Well, I guess that's it. Sometimes I've had problems, or I've known people who had problems with secular atheist family who say, "I can't believe you're adopting any religion," and they can be very strong in their viewpoints as well. But I use Christianity as an example because that I think is the most common and probably the most familiar to everyone in this group. There are some Christian family members who may not understand your conversion to Judaism, but will come around to it in time, especially when they realize that they would like to spend time with their grandchildren who are now Jewish. And that can be something which is really powerful for people to realize, well, my grandkids are happy and I want to spend time with them and celebrate with them. And this is a way I can do that. Maybe I need to soften my perspective, and that can happen over time. The third situation are people who will never understand why you're doing what you're doing, but will support you nonetheless. Say, I don't understand this whole Jewish thing. I don't know what it's all about. I don't know why you're doing it. But if it makes you happy, go for it. Those are people. They used to say when you're at the Thanksgiving table, never talk about politics or religion, right? That might be one of those cases where you just can't bring up religion in those types of relationships. They'll know you're Jewish, you know they're not Jewish, and you just, it's not an issue unless you make it an issue. And the last case, which can be difficult in its own right, is having a really loving and accepting family. My mom, who's sitting over here, had a really loving and accepting family, was raised by a mother, my last living grandparent, my grandmother, who I love, who is wonderful, who still goes to church. I think she goes to church every Sunday when she can, right?
Well, except she's in lockdown.
I mean, she's in lockdown because of the pandemic right now, but, I don't know if they have like a virtual church that she can go to. No, okay. I love my Catholic grandmother, but she was raised, and my mom, what's going on? Oh, and my mom was raised to be very accepting of other peoples, although she went to a Catholic school growing up, Catholic elementary, Catholic high school, Catholic college when she first started. Didn't she start at a Catholic? No, you went University of Cincinnati. Yeah. Oh, okay. Considered a Catholic college.
No.
You never thought about it?
No.
Okay. But grew up very, very Catholic, but was always raised with an acceptance and appreciation for other religions. Because that's who her parents were. When she converted to Judaism, as I said, my sister and I were grown. Actually, it was really nice. When I was studying to get into rabbinical school, because even just to get accepted, there's a big exam. When I was studying to get into rabbinical school, it was the same time that she was studying for her conversion, and so we even studied together sometimes. It was very nice. Her mother, this loving, accepting grandmother who knew her daughter was marrying a Jewish man who has other people, I've got cousins who are Buddhists, and I don't know what else. Probably a little bit of everything. Baptists, and we've got the United Nations within our family here, and her mother, who was the matriarch of this family, so loving and accepting for years, even though she was accepting of her conversion to Judaism, was still hoping that she would come back to Christianity, would send her, don't forget the mitten story. What's shared about the mittens? Oh, the mittens. That's a longer story for another time. Yeah. For years, my grandmother, after my mom's conversion, would send her little notes and articles about the church and Jesus and different saints, maybe hoping to subtly spark something. Maybe there's a chance she would come back to Catholicism. And I think eventually you had to talk with your mom about that and say, listen, it's not appropriate anymore. Is there anything you would like to say about that? Since I put you on the spot?
Just if anybody has a question.
Okay. We'll do a brief Q&A in a couple of minutes. Fair? Okay. So that pretty much runs the gamut of what kinds of experience you'll have with your family. Should I tell my family about my conversion? I can't answer that for you. How will my parents react to my conversion? I can't answer that for you. I can help guide you through those discussions on an individual basis, but we've sort of covered the range of what you might see. The only rule I can give you is only you know how you should handle different situations and different relationships in your life. There is a Jewish principle here at play. It's not about dishonesty, but about shalom bayit, about peace in the home. That there is something sacred about having healthy, loving relationships that in some cases can transcend even being extra open about your life. It's not a deception, but you could say it's a lie by omission, and that's uncomfortable, but there is a religiously justifiable reason to do that if it is preserving an important, loving relationship. We already touched a bit on how to talk about children, or how to talk to children, and explain these differences to them. The most important thing I can say for children, and I am so grateful that my parents, in their discussion, came to this conclusion: raise them with religion. The worst thing you can do for your kids is say, we're going to raise them with both, and they'll figure it out. Shalom bayit is a Jewish principle which means literally peace in the home. And it has to do with preserving sacred relationships between husband and wife, between parent and child, between maintaining the peace of the home. The example that's given in the Talmud, well, there are many examples that are given in the Talmud. Basically, roughly, idiomatically translates to, if your wife says, does this dress make me look fat? You should say, you look beautiful no matter what you wear. It's a paraphrase. That's shalom bayit. Linda is laughing in the other room. The worst thing you can do for your kids is to say, we're going to raise them without any religion, and when they're old enough, they'll figure it out. Or say, we're going to raise them with both, and then they can decide for themselves. Really, even though those sound very different, they're the same. As much as it might pain me as a rabbi to watch a Jewish family raise their children as Christians, I know that it happens, and I would rather see that than to see children raised with no religion at all, or put in the position where they're supposed to choose. Think of it this way: if parents can't choose to be both religions at the same time, how can you put that on your kids? It's impossible. You can't be two religions at once. I personally, in my experience, have never seen it work. I've met people who claim that it works, but I have never seen it work. Give your children the gift of making that decision for them. And guess what? They can still convert when they're adults if they find that this is not the path for them, just as you are converting because you have found the path for you. Their path may be different than yours, and that's okay. Let them come talk to me if they're wandering from Judaism and you're concerned for them. Oftentimes when people leave Judaism, I believe, I'm a little bit biased, I'm a rabbi, I believe that it's due to misconceptions or misunderstandings about what is in Judaism. I think that there are many answers. In fact, I think all the answers are in Judaism somewhere if you know where and how to look. That's me standing on the pulpit. I'm going to get down off the pulpit. We're in practical stuff now. Different people may have different paths. Do your kids a favor, raise them with a religion, give them that option. Because if you don't give them that option from the start, they're not going to have it later in life. They're going to be left lost and wandering. What is this deep conflict in families between, are you raising the children Jewish or Christian? It's not superficial. That's the first thing to understand. This is not about people digging in their heels just for the sake of digging in their heels. It's not people starting a fight or a conflict where there doesn't need to be one. These are serious principles that we're talking about here. For Christians, most Christians believe that your soul can only be saved through Christian practice, through certain beliefs and practices in Christianity. And if you don't follow those practices, then your soul will be condemned to eternal damnation. That's what many Christians truly and sincerely believe. And so when they say, how can you raise your children as Jews? In most cases, it's out of a genuine concern. I don't want my grandchildren's souls to be burning for all eternity in hell. That's what people really believe. And that's a serious thing. On the other hand, for Jews, even a Jewish partner, take again my parents for example. My father, when my sister and I were very young, was pretty secular. He was not as adamant about his Judaism as I think my mom was about her Christianity. But he knew that if his children were going to be raised with religion, that religion should be Judaism. Now, it's actually a longer story of how we came to that path as a family, but don't be surprised if you are joining a Jewish family, if you're meeting a Jewish partner, or if your children in the future encounter a Jewish partner who feels passionately and strongly, or if you meet other people who are converting who may come to you looking for advice and say, why is my Jewish partner who doesn't take their Judaism seriously, why are they so committed to me converting to Judaism or our children being raised Jewish? Because for Jews, it's a matter of survival. We know that there are just a small number of Jews in the entire world. We're a half of a percent of the world population. Even in the United States, only 2 out of 1,000 people are Jewish. Even in the United States. It's not even 1%. So when we look at the generation that's coming, our concern is that there might not be any Jews in the next generation unless we keep the tradition alive. It's an important burden that we carry forward in each generation. I shouldn't say burden. It's an important, what's a better word than burden? It's an important obligation that we carry forward to the next generation to make sure that Judaism does not die. That's not a concern that Christians have. I've never met a Christian who's concerned, what if there are no Christians in 100 years? I've never, ever met a Christian or a Muslim who said, what if there are no more Christians? What if there are no more Muslims in 100 years? But you talk to Jews, almost every single Jew you meet, at some level, has wondered or worried about this question, what if there are no more Jews in 100 years? because we're such a small people, and it is a very serious possibility. We have 3,500 years of tradition that we are carrying forward in our hearts and in our bones. And that is not something trivial either. You have two very different perspectives. It's hard to compare between them because the reasons for why it is so important for people that their grandparents be Jewish, or their grandchildren rather be Jewish, their grandchildren be Christian. There are such different reasons. Sometimes it's hard to reconcile those two because they come from very different places. There is no Jewish doctrine that says you have to be Jewish or your soul will suffer for eternity. And there is no Christian concern that there might not be any more Christianity. These are two very different things, but they're both very serious. And I find that these are, more than any other reasons, the fundamental and justifiable reasons why people feel so strongly about this. That's where I'm going to stop for today, even though I know we're way over time. Anybody who would like to stick around, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And anybody who would like to stick around,